morning. My name is Dr. Professor Zere Hon, a PhD MD. And today you're watching Canadian Histories. Today's episode is all about films or movies, or as they called it back then, motion pictures. Now, families and children and people of all ages absolutely loved watching movies. You know, back then movies were silent and colorless. They were black and white. It wasn't until the mid to late 1920s when movies were able to include soundtracks and dialogue between characters. People called them talkies. By the end of the 1920s, there were over 900 movie houses. That's what they called them back then. Movie theaters, that is. They called movie theaters movie houses back then. And the cost of a movie ticket? Only 27 cents. I think they're ripping us off these days. Come, let's talk more about these motion pictures. Did you know that James Freer is recognized as the first Canadian filmmaker? He was a farmer from Manitoba. And his documentaries were shown all across Europe in order to promote immigration to Manitoba. In 1917, the Ontario province established the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau to carry out educational work for farmers, school children, factory workers, and other classes. Not to mention, the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau was the first state-funded film organization in the world. Shortly after, the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau was created in 1918. Initially contracting companies to make films, the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau had full control of editing and distribution. It wasn't until 1923 when the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau bought its own studio in Trenton, Ontario. That's when they began producing their own educational films, producing up to 1,500 reels monthly by 1925. These movies were filmed in churches, schools, and community institutions. Unfortunately for the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau, the Hepburn government didn't want them. On October 26, 1934, it had been officially dissolved. Remember when I mentioned the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau? Well, that was created in September of 1918, and it was originally called the Exhibit and Publicity Bureau. But then it got renamed to the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau on April 1st of 1923. The CGMPB, or the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau, was the first national film production unit in the world and was intended to promote trade and industry. Its first success was the bi-weekly series Living Canada, which began production in 1919 and was distributed throughout the British Empire and in numerous foreign countries, including the United States. The purpose of the CGMPB was, according to the Minister of Trade and Commerce, advertising abroad Canada's scenic attractions, agricultural resources, and industrial development. The Bureau's popularity was from 1920 to 1931, when it had the largest and best equipment film studio in Canada, and distributed its films throughout Canada and the British Empire, as well as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Argentina, Chile, Japan, China, and the United States. At its peak in 1927, the Bureau had more than 1,000 prints circulating in the United States alone. All good things must come to an end, and that was true for the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau. During the Great Depression, both quality and output of films had dropped due to underfunding, lack of innovation, poor leadership, and outdated equipment. The Bureau continued to produce silent films until 1934. As a result, several government departments began producing their own promotional films rather than relying on the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau. In 1938, the Government of Canada invited John Grierson, a British film critic and filmmaker, to study the state of the government's film production, and this led to the National Film Act of 1939 and the establishment of the National Film Board of Canada. The National Film Act's purpose was to produce and distribute and promote the production and distribution of films designed to interpret Canada and Canadians to other nations. The National Film Board was founded to create propaganda in support of the Second World War. In 1940, with Canada at War, the National Film Board launched its Canada Carries On series of morale-boosting theatrical shorts. Unfortunately for the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau, in 1941, the National Film Board absorbed it. Unfortunately, we are reaching the final moments of our show, but I would like to let you know, even through all this in the Canadian history of motion picture, it was always just below the Hollywood of America. Canada was never able to surpass them. Even now, they are not able to surpass Hollywood, but that doesn't mean many Canadians did not profit from Hollywood. These Canadians became actresses and actresses. These included Mary Pickford, who ironically was known as America's sweetheart. But, she's Canadian, so... Florence Lawrence, Glenn Ford, and Mary Dressler are just to name a few of Canadians that were successful during those times in American Hollywood. That is our show for today. I'm Dr. Professor Uzair Irfan, PhD, MD, and we'll talk later. Yes!
Proclamations are to my subjects I'm about to read. So my advice is all of you keep order. If the dictates of this proclamation none of you will heed, then each of you will be just one head shorter. For I'm the Queen. I'm the Queen. My subjects must remember I'm supreme. I can even take a life, or a husband from a wife. I can eat peas with my knife, for I'm the Queen.